Welcome to part 2 of examining ethics in nursing research. Consistent with the ethical principles, nurses who critically appraise published studies, review research for conduct in their agencies, or assist with data collection for a study have an obligation to determine whether the rights of the research participants have been protected. The human rights that require protection in research are the rights to the following: self-determination, privacy, anonymity and confidentiality, fair treatment, and protection from discomfort and harm. The American Nurses Association Code of Ethics for Nurses reiterates these rights and provides nurses with guidelines for ethical conduct in nursing practice and research. This code focuses on protecting the rights of patients and research participants. The right to self-determination is based on the ethical principle of respect for persons, and this indicates that humans are capable of controlling their own destiny. People should be given autonomy, which means having the freedom to conduct their lives as they choose without external controls. Researchers protect the autonomy of subjects when they provide information about a study and allow the participants to choose whether or not they participate. In addition, a subject who consents and begins a study is allowed to withdraw from the study at any time without penalty. The culture of the subject should be one factor that is considered in treating persons autonomously, because autonomy does have different interpretations and implications in varying cultures. You can see this in the Tuskegee syphilis study highlighted. Nurses are considered educationally prepared to advocate for potential research subjects of different backgrounds because of the nurse's knowledge of cultural values related to autonomy and decision making. Potential subjects may be more open to consenting to a study when the recruiter is a member of their culture, or more open to discussing a study with a researcher who shares their culture. So this all needs to be considered. A subject's right to self-determination can be violated through the use of coercion, covert data collection, and deception, which there are good examples in the movie Miss Evers' Boys. Coercion occurs when a person intentionally presents an overt threat of harm or an excessive reward to another to obtain compliance. Some subjects are coerced or forced to participate in research because they fear harm or discomfort if they don't participate. So, for example, some patients, when asked by their healthcare provider to participate in a study, might fear that their medical or nursing care would be negatively affected if they don't agree. And so they would agree for that fear, even if it's an irrational fear. Others are coerced to participate in studies because they believe that they can't refuse the excessive rewards offered, such as a large sum of money, special privileges, or access to experimental treatments. The Willowbrook study occurred in a facility that was overcrowded, and the only available admission to the hospital was to the research unit, and so parents felt coerced to admit their children for care despite having concerns about the research being conducted in that facility. With covert data collection, subjects are unaware that research data are being collected. So one example of this is during the Jewish chronic disease hospital study. Most of the patients and the physicians were unaware of the study. The subjects were informed that they were receiving an injection of cells. The word cancer was omitted, though. The use of deception, the actual misinforming of subjects for research purposes, does also violate a subject's right to self-determination. A classic example of deception is seen in the Milgram study, in which subjects thought they were administering electric shocks to another person, but the person was really a professional actor who pretended to feel the shocks. So even though nobody was hurt in it, it still was deceptive in what was presented to the participants. Deception should only be used when absolutely necessary to study topics with a potential to make significant contributions to science. And to be acceptable, the use of deception should not be expected to cause any long-lasting harm. So researchers should explain the deception to the subjects as soon as possible. And in order to be used ethically in a study, the researcher should inform potential subjects that they will be unaware of or deliberately misguided about the true purpose of the study, and they agree to participate despite this condition. So it seems like nobody would participate if you told them this, but a lot of times the deception doesn't have to be something that's harmful or scary. So people still will participate, but we owe it to them to tell them the truth. So what groups are included as people with diminished autonomy? Persons have diminished autonomy when they have impaired decision making due to different circumstances like medications, mental illness, or mental capacity. Depending on the cause, diminished autonomy may be temporary or permanent. Persons with diminished autonomy require additional protection of their rights because of their decreased ability to give informed consent. So in addition, they are vulnerable to coercion and deception. Children are definitely one of these populations, and they're considered to have diminished autonomy because of their emotional immaturity and cognitive development. So parents or guardians are the legal representatives of a child and may, on the child's behalf, give permission to participate in research. Researchers not only obtain parental consent, but they also have to solicit assent to participate in research from the child. Assent means that the child has agreed to participate in the study. And determining the appropriate age at which to involve the child in decisions about participating in research is complex. There is a figure in your textbook, 4.3. It's a simplified view of the factors that affect the methods to obtain parental permission, or parental consent, and pediatric assent. The figure displays the child, family, and culture as one social system interacting with the other social system, which is comprised of the study, the researcher, and the organization that is conducting the research. In that model, the inner circle is labeled as child, and so that represents the communication and comprehension of the child. But the child's ability to listen or absorb information through media affects the comprehension of the child. So the interaction of biological age, the intellectual development, the degree of consciousness, and psychological and emotional maturity affect a child's communication and comprehension. The family that surrounds the child in that model represents parents' or guardians' perceptions of the child's decision-making ability. And then the outer ring is the role of children in the family's culture and the extent to which children are allowed to participate in decision-making. The relationships between parents and between the parents and the child directly affect how decisions will be made in a family system about research participation. And so that is taken into consideration. The thing is, we can't guarantee that a parent or a legal guardian is acting on the best conscious of the child, but if they have guardianship, we give them that opportunity. So privacy, or the right to privacy, is the freedom people have to determine the time, extent, and general circumstances under which their private information will be shared with or withheld from others. Private information includes a person's attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, opinions, and records. The research subject's privacy is protected if the subject is informed and consents to participate in a study and voluntarily shares private information with a researcher. An invasion of privacy occurs when private information is shared without a person's knowledge or against his or her will. A research report often indicates that the subject's privacy was protected, and it might include details of how this was accomplished. Generally, a report would include a note stating the efforts to maintain privacy. So it might say something like, the researchers safeguarded the privacy of personal health information by maintaining all files related to the study under lock and key. And or it might say to protect privacy, unique identification numbers instead of names were used on all data collection forms, and the actual files were discarded or shredded or something like that. HIPAA expanded the protection of a person's privacy, specifically the individually identifiable health information. The right to anonymity, and confidentiality. So on the basis of the right to privacy, a research subject has the right to anonymity and the right to assume that the data collected will be kept confidential. Complete anonymity exists when the researcher can't link a subject's identity with their individual responses. In most studies, researchers do know the identity of their subjects, and they promise the subjects that their identity will be kept anonymous from others and that the research data would be kept confidential. Confidentiality is the researcher's safe management of information or data shared by a subject to ensure that the data is kept private from others. The researcher agrees not to share the subject's information without their authorization. According to the American Nurses Association, confidentiality is grounded in two premises. Those are, because individuals own their personal information, they may share personal information to the extent that they wish and with whom they wish. And then also, accepting personal information comes with an obligation to maintain confidentiality, an obligation that is even greater for researchers and nurses. You think all the time nurses are privy to confidential information and observations of patients, and so the American Nurses Association does outline how we need to keep that information. A breach of confidentiality can occur when a researcher, either by accident or direct action, allows an unauthorized person to gain access to the raw data. Confidentiality also can be breached in reporting or publishing a study if a participant's identity is accidentally revealed. In quantitative studies, results are presented for subgroups or groups, so a breach of confidentiality is much less likely to occur. In qualitative studies, though, a breach of confidentiality is more likely because a researcher gathers data from fewer study participants and occasionally reports long quotes made by those participants. Also, a qualitative researcher and participant often have a relationship in which detailed stories of the participant lives are shared. Remember, these are their experiences. And so this requires careful management of study data to ensure confidentiality. Breaches of confidentiality are especially harmful to participants when factors like religious preference, sexual practices, income, racial prejudices, drug use, or child abuse are shared. Participants' confidentiality should be maintained during data collection, analysis, and reporting. And research findings, whether quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods, should be reported so that a participant or group of participants can't be identified by their responses. The right to fair selection and treatment is based on the ethical principle of justice. According to this principle, people must be treated fairly and receive what they are owed, or treated in a way that is equitable to the treatment of other persons in the same situation. Injustices in subject selection have resulted from social, cultural, racial, and sexual biases. Many of the instances we'll be talking about in the discussion board are these instances. For many years, research was conducted on categories of people who were deemed as less valuable, like those living in poverty, prisoners, slaves, persons of a minority race or ethnicity. Researchers often treated these subjects without regard for harm or discomfort, and they sacrificed their protection for the sake of scientific or personal gain. Another concern with subject selection is that Some researchers select subjects because they like them and want them to receive the benefits of a study. Other researchers have been swayed by power or money to ensure that certain patients become subjects so they can receive potentially beneficial treatments. Random selection of subjects can eliminate some researcher bias that might influence subject selection and strengthen design of the study. That's why randomized controlled trials are such better evidence than other studies. Each study needs to include a consent form describing the researcher's role and subjects' participation in a study. A consent form is actually an agreement between the two about what each will do during the study. So while conducting this study, the researcher must treat subjects fairly and respect that agreement. For example, the activities or procedures that subjects are to perform shouldn't be changed without the IRB's approval, and any benefits promised to the subject should be provided and distributed without regard for age, race, or socioeconomic level. The research report needs to indicate that the selection and treatment of subjects were fair. Inclusion criteria should reflect the research problem and study purpose. For example, the statement of the research problem might be the few studies identifying the work-related stresses of registered nurses in acute care in the early years of their career. The purpose of the study was to explore the lived experiences of work-related stress among acute care RNs in the first 5 years after graduation. So the inclusion criteria would be nurses employed in acute care for at least 1 year and less than 6 years. So exclusion criteria should be justified to protect potential subjects who are at higher risk for harms or to avoid the unintentional influence of a participant's characteristics on the study results. So exclusion criteria for that study would be nurses who were working at more than one acute care facility or nurses who were pursuing an advanced degree, because either of those conditions would influence the stress experienced at work. So it would give us incorrect results. The right to protection from harm and discomfort in a study is based on the ethical principle of beneficence, which states that we should do good and above all do no harm. According to this principle, members of society must take an active role in preventing discomfort and harm and promoting good in the world around them. In research, discomfort and harm can be physical, emotional, social, or economic, or any combination of those types. Studies range from no anticipated discomfort and harm to a high risk of discomfort and harm. Research designs that involve a review of medical records or files or secondary analysis of de-identified data collected for another study have no anticipated discomfort and harm. And when there is no or minimal interaction between the researcher and the subject, the study would usually be an exempt study or an IRB exempt study. Studies that cause temporary discomfort are described as minimal risk studies, in which the discomfort is similar to what the subject would encounter in his or her daily life, and it's temporary, ending when the study is complete. Subjects in a minimal risk study may complete questionnaires or participate in interviews. Physical discomfort is minimal. It would include things like fatigue, headache, or muscle tension. Anxiety or embarrassment might result from answering questions on sensitive topics. And the only economic harm in a minimal risk study would be like the cost of travel to the study site. Most clinical nursing studies examining the effect of a treatment involve minimal risk. Discomfort and harm during some studies may go beyond the minimal level and involve unusual levels of temporary discomfort. In studies with unusual levels of temporary discomfort, subjects may experience discomfort during and after the study. Unusual levels of temporary discomfort might be experienced during a study in which subjects have been confined to bed for 3 days to explore associations between immobility and muscle weakness. Muscle weakness might continue after the study until the subject is fully recovered. Unusual levels of discomfort or harm may occur when subjects experience failure, extreme fear, or threats to their identity as part of a study. Qualitative researchers ask questions that might cause participants to relive a crisis, like being diagnosed with colon cancer or losing a spouse. Reliving experiences or acting in an unnatural way involves unusual levels of temporary discomfort. So in studies with unusual levels, the researcher would describe the exclusion criteria for the sample in the IRB protocol. And exclusion criteria are developed to prevent recruitment of subjects who are higher risk for long-term discomfort or harm. So one example of that would be in the study involved being confined to bed, persons with pulmonary disease would be excluded due to their high risk for pneumonia, or a coagulopathy would be excluded because of their risk for a DVT, right? A potential participant for a qualitative study related to recovery following a sexual assault might be excluded if they were currently receiving counseling from a professional. The research team would also indicate in the IRB protocol and research reports the ways in which they assessed participants' discomfort and then the resources they made available. So studies in which there is the risk of permanent damage will undergo additional scrutiny by the IRB. The rationale for doing the study must establish reasons why the knowledge from the study couldn't be gained in another way and what would be done to prevent or minimize damage. Biomedical studies involving new medications and devices are more likely to cause permanent damage than studies that a nurse would typically initiate. So we probably wouldn't see a lot of these. The Nazi medical experiments and the Tuskegee syphilis study are examples of studies in which subjects had a certainty of experiencing permanent damage. Conducting research that has a certainty of causing permanent damage to study subjects is highly questionable, regardless of the benefits that would be gained. Frequently, the benefits gained from such a study are experienced not by the person participating in the research, but to others in society. And studies causing permanent damage to subjects violate the principles of the Nuremberg Code and should not be conducted. Informed consent is providing information to a potential subject and the opportunity to participate in the study. The process doesn't end with the subject's signature on a document agreeing to be in a study, though. The researcher, guided by the principle of beneficence and committed to the protection of the right to self-determination, describes the study and what subjects will be asked to do. A potential subject's decision about whether to participate is the consenting part of the process. If the risk and benefits of participating change during a study, the researcher maintains trust by sharing that information with subjects. Subjects provide ongoing consent by continuing to participate in a study with the assurance that they can withdraw at any time. I like that picture of the gentleman running away from the shot, because even if it's something like, you don't want to get a shot, if that is what the participant, if that's what calls them to leave a study, researchers definitely need to be considerate of that. So what information is included for consent? The components of informed consent are listed on this slide. They're outlined in box 4.4 of your text. Some general requirements is that consent is comprehensible. So circumstances provide opportunity to discuss and make deliberate decisions without pressure. So a decision shouldn't be made in a rush, and the person would have adequate time to make that decision. Language needs to be understandable, so not medical language maybe, but in layman's terms. And information needs to be presented not as unrelated facts, but in a way that would be meaningful for the client. Informed consent means information, people can be cautious, so the subject doesn't waive legal rights or release the researcher or funder from negligence. So informed consent doesn't mean that you allow people to break the law in obtaining the research. And that is another issue that we'll see in the examples that we get to discuss. Also, the information needs to be complete but concise. I feel like this would be an example of those whenever you download an app, the information you have to agree to. It's like 20 pages of font 5 information. This would not be informed consent kind of material. Informed consent says that you would have sufficient information that a reasonable person would want to make a decision, but not too much information that would make them not want to read it. Also, information needs to be comprehensive. So the purpose and procedures of the research study, how long the person's going to be involved, what are the benefits, risk, or discomfort, are they going to get any compensation for any potential research-related injury, would they be allowed alternative treatments if they were available. We need to ensure that they have their confidentiality of records. Participants need to have the people that they would contact in event of wanting to withdraw or asking questions, and ways to contact them, and then the right to refuse or withdraw without the loss of benefits that were promised in the study. So this slide talks about institutional review boards. And although your groups obtained approval from the IRB last semester, I believe much of that was done on your behalf, not that you did it yourself. So I do feel like it's reasonable to discuss what the institutional review board is. An IRB is a committee that reviews research to ensure that the investigators are conducting the research ethically. So IRBs have authority to approve, require modifications, and disapprove studies that it reviews. If unforeseen problems occur during a study, the IRB needs to be notified and the study would be stopped until the issue is resolved and the IRB approves the continuation of the study. Universities, hospitals, corporations, and other healthcare organizations have IRBs to promote the conduct of ethical research and to protect the rights of prospective subjects at their institutions. Institutional Review Board composition and function are regulated by the federal government. I would say during the pandemic, when everything was closed down, IRBs are probably inundated with information now because a lot of research was asked to be halted. And so many studies were disbanded and now will be seeking approval again. So each IRB has at least 5 members of varying backgrounds. The backgrounds need to be varying in cultural, economic, educational, gender, and racial diversity to promote complete scholarly and fair review of research commonly conducted in an institution. At least one member of an IRB board has scientific expertise, and at least one member is a community member without scientific training. The same member or another member is not affiliated with the institution in any way. The members are sensitive to the attitudes of the community it serves, and they're educated about the federal regulations, institutional policies, and standards of professional conduct by which studies are to be evaluated. If an institution regularly reviews studies with subjects who are vulnerable to coercion or undue influence, one or more members of the IRB should have experience working with persons who are similar to those potential subjects. IRB members must not have a conflicting interest related to a study conducted in an institution. So, for example, if a member of the IRB proposes a study to be conducted in the institution, the member couldn't also be involved in the deliberation and decision about the study, other than to provide information to the IRB. Some categories of exempt research. There are exempt and expedited levels of reviews conducted by institutional reviews boards. The functions and operations of an IRB involve the review of research to determine the appropriate level of review. The IRB chairperson or committee, not the researcher, decide the level of the review required for each study. So the pyramid shows a full review, expedited, and exempt. Some studies will be exempt from requiring IRB approval. These would be studies that pose no apparent risk to research subjects. Once a study is deemed to be exempt, the IRB doesn't require continuing review of the study as it would for other levels. Studies conducted by nurses frequently are evaluated as being exempt from review. Many of your questionnaires would have been exempt from IRB review. Box 4.5 of your text lists characteristics of studies that are exempt from review. These are usually studies conducted in established education settings. They could be education tests, surveys, interviews, or observations of public behavior when the subject is not identified and minimal risk with the data, or they aren't linked to the subject. A study would be exempt if it used a benign behavioral intervention and data that weren't linked to subjects, or it could be exempt if they used data that were publicly available, de-identified, or collected to evaluate government projects or public services. Studies may meet the criteria to receive an expedited review if they carry some risks, but the risks are minimal. The IRB chairperson or one or more experienced IRB members conduct an expedited review. And again, it's not the researcher who says this would be an expedited review. It is the IRB who says they would put it in that pile rather than the full review. Under an expedited review procedure, the reviewers would exercise all the authority of the IRB except disapproval of the research. So descriptive studies in which subjects are asked to respond to questionnaires would usually need only expedited reviews. So many, I would say most of this class had their questionnaires either exempt or expedited last semester. Box 4.6 of your text lists characteristics of studies eligible for expedited review. This is reserved for studies with minimal risks and data are collected through one of the following means. Might be small amounts of blood collected by venipuncture or finger stick, biological specimens collected by non-invasive means. Think like placental evaluation, right? Or tissue biopsies. It could be non-invasive readings or images collected by usual diagnostic procedures, so lab data. It could be voice, video, or digital recordings of interviews and focus groups. It could be medical records when subjects can potentially be identified. If data are de-identified, and the study might be exempt. Expedited review might be for questionnaires or surveys of cultural beliefs, communication, perception, and social behavior. Again, HIPAA influences an IRB in that we need to make sure that we're following HIPAA by reading the report carefully and thinking about the procedures that were implemented. Data needs to be collected so that we protect personal identifying health information and when we consider the risk-benefit ratio. This slide lists some of the components you'll be analyzing as you read research and other peer-reviewed journal articles as you step into practice. You need to be reading this portion of the study if it is a sample subject, or thinking about it if you're doing research that includes any data collection. The constant changes in healthcare and technology create new challenge in research ethics. 3 areas that continue to evolve are issues related to genomics research, using animals in studies, and research misconduct. Ethical violations still exist. There's lots of examples in your textbook, online, in journal articles, and so they'll require you to be cognizant of these concepts throughout your professional career. That is it for the information. I miss seeing you in person. I get to see a few of you every once in a while, and it is nice. I know you guys are enjoying preceptorship, and I hope you're doing well. I love this content and the discussion board. And so I'm definitely looking forward to reviewing your discussion board posts. For the most part, I try to allow students to interact solely with one another, but occasionally I can't help but pop in and make a comment. So don't be offended if I don't comment, and if I only comment to a few, it's not because I didn't want to comment to everybody. I want you to please remember to review the discussion grading rubric, as I will hold you accountable to those standards within this course. I feel like a lot of times students don't give the discussion board the attention that I've required of it, because I really do feel like it's a great tool for learning and engaging. And so I hold people to that grading rubric, and I just want to warn you of that ahead of time. All right, I'm looking forward to seeing you again in class soon.